Hello and welcome to today's Missio Nexus webinar. I'm Heather Pubels, the founder of Le Motif, a communications consulting firm and Missio Nexus member organization. I'm also the editor of Evangelical Missions Quarterly. I'm partnering with Missio Nexus to discover topics and find effective presenters that can address ways mission agencies can improve both their marketing and communications efforts. Before we get started with the webinar, I wanted to let you know that Missio Nexus has a group called Communications. If you are involved in marketing or communications with a mission agency, this group is designed for you. It's a great place for you to meet, learn from, and be encouraged by others in your domain. At the end of this webinar, I'll give instructions on how to find and sign up for that group. For today, Morgan Lee will be presenting our webinar entitled, So You Want to Have a Podcast. Morgan is a digital media journalist at Christianity Today and was the host and producer of the award-winning news podcast called Quick to Listen. She currently lives in Honolulu, Hawaii. Morgan, I was wondering if you could tell us about a story you've worked on that changed your perspective in a significant way in your life or your faith.
Hey, everyone. It is great to be here. And I was going to say good morning, but I recognize that it is that is true for me, but not necessarily for all of you who are on this call today. So, Heather, I was glad that you asked this question, and it had me doing some soul searching of my own to one of the first interviews that I did when I was at Christianity Today. I did it with a woman named Jean Bishop, and Jean is based in Chicago. She is a public defender, and being a public defender is a job that I think few of us actually have the mental fortitude to do. You represent people who have no means to defend themselves otherwise. And often have been accused of fairly heinous crimes. But the twist in the story is that Heather actually lost her sister and brother-in-law and their unborn child to a random home break-in. And she also ended up building a relationship with the person who murdered her sister while he was incarcerated.
Wow.
And all of those circumstances being true in one person at the same time have continually blown my mind. I interviewed her back in 2015. And then on my podcast, Quick to Listen, we interviewed her about 2 years ago. And to me, it really summed up like what being a Christian is sitting in all of that at a personal cost to yourself.
Yeah.
All of the time. Obviously, she chose to not only not run away from the worst thing that ever happened to her life, but to figure out how to love Jesus directly in the midst of it. And then she has not shied away from what that shows up in her professional work as well. And I know not all of us would be able to have the bleed in of all of those things existing at the same time, but I have been truly just struck by someone who I feel like walks the walk in a way that exemplifies personal cost. And I find it very powerful. So that is probably one of the most profound stories that I've had a chance to work on.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. We're looking forward to hearing more. I just want to remind everyone to please put your questions in the chat panel as you think of them. Throughout Morgan's presentation, we'll be getting to some of those different questions. There'll be chances to ask questions then and at the end. We'll also have a handout at the very end that you can download. And I think that's it for my initial announcements. Morgan, it's great to have you here with us today, and welcome. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you. All right, let us begin. All right. So my hope today is that everyone here is a podcast fan, and I would like to, if we can, start off a little bit with people typing in the chat what their favorite podcasts are. And Heather, if you see those come in, maybe you don't mind sharing and reading some of them. I'll talk a little bit about my favorite podcasts while we wait for those to come in. So I have to say that I've gone through feast and famine stages of being into podcasts. I'm currently someone who listens a lot to a daily sports show that ESPN puts out. I really appreciate that they do deeper dives into sports stories or stories that are happening in the sports world that may have social repercussions. I also listen to a podcast that some of you may be familiar with called This American Life, which has a very large gamut of issues that they end up talking about, whether it's what the inner workings of the Republican Party in Arizona, or assisted suicide, or how kids are processing mass shootings. They do a lot of really like specific human-centered journalism. So it's not just going to give you a sense of policy. It's going to do a lot of like talking to people in general. And at various times, I have also gotten into this zombie podcast, which is called, let me see, All Alone, A Story of Survival. And that podcast is obviously a fictionalized show. The first kind of iteration of that show was 140 episodes long, very long. And now they are doing a spinoff version of that. So kind of have somewhat diverse podcast interests. Heather, what did you see from our attendees today as far as what they like listening to?
We have Renovare and CT. Somebody else put The Mission Matters. I think that's the Missio Nexus podcast. The Next Right Thing with Emily P. Freeman and Maverick by Pioneers. Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. It's a Ruth Haley Barton one. The Holy Post, somebody put. How I Built This. That's a different NPR show. Somebody else has just mentioned that they have a hard time staying focused on podcasts. So they're not really a listener, but understand the popularity and the opportunity. I like The Hidden Brain. That's one of my favorites.
That's a fun one as well. Yep. Just to give my own commentary on some of what you all have shared. When I hosted my podcast, Quick to Listen, we had Ruth on our show. So shout out to Strengthening the Soul of Leadership. How I Built This, I also really enjoyed hearing. For those of you who don't listen to that show, it's a show where they talk to a lot of founders and entrepreneurs and get a sense of how exactly their company became the company that we now know as a household name. Brad, as far as what you were saying, that you have a hard time staying focused on podcasts, it's interesting because podcasts are definitely a medium where I feel personally like I have to be doing something else when I'm listening to them. But there are some times when that other thing that I'm doing is making it actually challenging for me to pay attention to that thing. So anyway, thanks guys for sharing. Hopefully there'll be some more time. I do invite all of you guys to post questions as we go along. I really like doing something that feels really interactive and helpful for people. And so you can feel free to ask questions at any step of the way. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself to start. So here it says podcast host, producer, and consultant. I think many of you guys are familiar with CT's Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which I am continually staggered by the number of listeners and downloads we had when it came to that show. At one point, it made it into the top 5 of all podcasts on Apple Podcasts, which was really mind-blowing to see the impact of something that we had created. But a couple of years prior to that, my boss at the time got a mandate to start podcasts at Christianity Today. And I happened to be working with him on the team at that time. And he was like, all right, do you want to be the person that is doing this podcast? And I was a little bit confused about what we were going to turn into, but these conversations that I had with him eventually turned into a podcast that I hosted from 2016 until last year, called Quick to Listen. And that was a once a week interview news show. We told people we wanted to go beyond hashtags and hot takes and really give people a sense of either two things. One, insight on something that was happening in the Christian world, or two, how to understand what was happening in the world from a Christian perspective. And we recorded at the beginning and end up being, maybe 20 to 25 minutes worth of content to give folks. Later on, we recorded a podcast that it went beyond an hour just because the scope of what we were asking continued to expand during that time. But I I'm supremely proud of what we were able to pull off on that show. And I know that it was really transformative just for my own faith to talk to so many really smart and gifted Christians in this format. A couple other things that I will mention is that I'm someone who really has trouble doing what I would call indoor activities. And I would count podcasts in them. When I say by that is that even though I'm very into podcasts, it's hard for me to devote my free time to spending more time on my computer editing audio or recording a show. And so during the pandemic, when there were less options of places to go out and things to do, I actually launched 2 more podcasts. I did one for CT called Prayer Amid Pandemic, and that one also won an award, which I was extremely excited about. That podcast had 2 purposes. One of them was that I really wanted to give everyone that was experiencing the pandemic a sense that you were not alone, and that this was being something that had happened in other parts of church history. And so we did essentially mini profiles on different figures of Christian history whose lives were shaped by illness, sickness, pandemic, the plague, etc. And then we had a moment where I gave updates about how COVID was playing out in different parts of the world. And we joined other Christians in prayer from around the world as well. So that was a wonderful show to work on. I also developed my own show called All Alone and sent out maybe 5 questions a week to, I think at one point the mailing list grew up to 60 people who answered them in an audio file. And then we turned that into a podcast and just kind of had people reflect on how they were experiencing the pandemic in the moment. So those are the types of shows that I have had experience making. And today, I would say the purpose of this presentation is to help you think about how you want to make a podcast that actually works beyond just turning on as some sort of audio capturing device and uploading it, into a space that would allow you to publish it. So let's continue to go through this.
I have a couple of questions, Morgan, which I think you might get to, but from Brad, what have you discovered to be the sweet spot in terms of length for a podcast? And then his second question is, have you found that podcasts that involve more than one presenter, whether an interview or a team going back and forth, tend to be better received?
Those are really good questions. Can I answer them a little bit later on?
Yep.
Yes. Heather, please feel free to raise those questions again if I do not mention those in a great detail later on. So I wanted to kind of break down for people what I see to be the 3 ingredients, or let's just think of it, the 3 components of podcasts that I would say any person who aspires to make a podcast needs to think through. Right? Again, I titled this particular presentation the way that I did because, as you know, I think so many times we're in conversations with people and people might say, I want to start a podcast, or have you thought about starting a podcast? Or you might feel a certain level of chemistry or rapport with a friend or a colleague, and you feel like the conversation we had should be a podcast. There's some sort of thing about the medium of podcasting that feels so much more accessible than, you rarely hear people say, like, do you want to make a documentary? Or, do you even want to have a radio show? I know that's somewhat in the same lane, but people think of podcasts as being very doable and attainable and something that they are able to participate in. And so I want to just give some pointers about how to conceptualize this in a way that would make your podcast, in my hope, successful. One of those things being successful, meaning that you can continue to put out new podcasts over the period of time that you want to, that you don't necessarily burn out, that you're creating something that is compelling for people to listen to, and that they're going to want to keep engaging in week after week, since that is the cycle of most shows, and that you feel is occupying, auditory real estate that hasn't been done by other people before. So as you can see, the components that I'm thinking that folks in here should be doing some thinking about are what I would call the hook, and then we'll talk about the host, and then we'll talk about the segments. So when I recorded Quick to Listen, our show was based on current events, on news itself. And the thing about that is that that was something that was completely outside of our show that we used to have our discussions about that, right? This was an externally generated, what I call hook, that kept people tuning in week after week. And you could see oftentimes the level of hunger that people had for a Christian conversation about this type of thing by the fact, we would look at the number of listens and so forth. And as you might imagine, there were certain very, very, very controversial things that happened, whether it might be something that happened in the Southern Baptist Convention or some particular remarks that Trump had made at a particular moment where people would feel like they were craving for some level of insight, some level of response. And that was what would push them to seek out our show. Obviously, there were a number of, loyal listeners who were interested no matter what, right? But oftentimes they became loyal because they were people who really followed the news, were Christians, and we were pretty narrow in how we really wanted to cater this to, right? We often felt like it was very important that we choose guests who were going to be folks who had really rock solid Christian convictions and were also experts in their particular field that made them qualified to talk about that topic. That was what Quick to Listen's hook was. But I'll just give you some other different examples of hooks that I've seen, just to give people a sense of what this looks like. Some of you guys may listen to recaps. So recaps are oftentimes, right, where the host or hosts is watching a particular show, and they are, each week of the podcast or each episode of the podcast is related to recapping and discussing and going over a particular episode of the show. The one that you guys may be most familiar with is The Office Ladies, which if anyone here is a fan of The Office, this includes two of the former stars of the show talking about how much they love the show. But there's also lots of other versions of this. People who are really big into these fandoms, they can really, really get into these recaps, and people really, really love them. So that's one example of a hook. Again, something that's like outside of that. Another one, going back to our Mars Hill podcast, right? In the Mars Hill podcast, we were telling a larger story. So what was the hook each time? People really wanted to hear the conclusion of each story. And so you're going to tune into it week after week. This is true for the zombie podcast I listen to as well. Maybe at the edge of your seat, you want to know what happened. That is the hook that is provided for people to keep on continuing to listen. I think some podcasts, the hook is a little bit similar to Quick to Listen, wanting to know information about something. So maybe it can be news, it can be information, it can be recapping, it can be, again, leaving people in suspense. So those are different particular ways that people get really invested in your show, which is really what you want to have happen. And so what I really challenge people when they are saying that they want to do something regarding a show is answering this particular question. And you may say like, well, I don't think it should be week after week, but I would encourage most of you guys to do something with some level of consistency, even if it's going to be a limited show, right? Where you maybe only are going to do 6 episodes on something. It's going to be really challenging to continue and sustain momentum for something if you're just dropping an episode once a month, for instance, versus once a week. But answering this question to me feels very key. All right. Heather, do we have any questions, or shall I head to?
You can keep going. We just have a comment that somebody, Stacy says she also loves Office Ladies.
That's awesome. It's really like a genius way to re-engage people with the show. Like, who doesn't want to hear from the actual cast members themselves to go from that, especially if the cast members are funny and charming. I guess that could also not be the case. All right. So we have, what type of relationships are you trying to build with your listeners? I have co-hosted shows and I have solo hosted shows. So I know we had a question earlier about what we want to do or how we think about the number of people that should be in the space when it comes to having hosts. It really comes down to how formal or personable or interactive or engaging do you want your people to see themselves with the host? Like, are you some kind of place where you are, acting as a proxy for the audience to understand the world that's happening, whether because you're interviewing someone, or are you trying to do something where you set yourself up as a level of authority, right? There are a number of podcasts where the host themselves is the person that has the certain level of expertise or information, right? I think we can think of maybe different history podcasts that people go on specifically because they want to learn about a historical event, or podcasts sometimes where it's what I would call like the roundtable shows, where you have maybe 3 or 4 people. Now, obviously, sometimes roundtable shows are more about just the banter, the laughter, the poking fun at each other, the way that people are engaging each other. But sometimes they're also because those 3 or 4 people are experts in some ways, but they may not actually have the same opinions, or they may not agree with each other on particular issues. So the host is really about what dynamic you're trying to create. I know personally, I listen to some shows and I find the chemistry to be between the hosts to be one where I personally feel like they're my friends. I know that's weird, but I truly think of like I have my own personal relationship with people after I've heard them get emotional, share personal details or what I perceive to be personal details about their lives, to getting to laugh alongside people all the time. And I'm not sure how many of you guys would resonate with this, but I find often that audio is a very personal and intimate medium where you have just the sense to really feel like you're maybe just like a nonverbal participant in someone's conversation that they're having. And I love that part about audio. And I think there's a tremendous amount of possibility. If people want to share some of the podcast hosts that they like, I'd definitely be interested to know. You can go ahead and type those into the chat. But yeah, those are the things that are important to me when I'm trying to decide who should be in the room taping this and who should be there. Mostly like when we think of hosts, we're trying to think who should be there week after week. I will say that when I first started Quick to Listen, I did the podcast alongside someone who cut a pretty similar profile to me, in that they were also a female Christian journalist and they were about 7 years older than I was. And the reason I bring that up is because I actually think that our podcast really improved when this person left, and then we replaced them with our current editor-in-chief at that time, who was a baby boomer, was a guy, had a different like temperament than me. And I think it was really appealing for listeners to hear from someone who could play more of a foil to who I was. So I would not shy away from doing things that might seem, maybe like they're an odd pairing, in the sense that I often think that it gives your listeners more people to kind of relate to who's in the room, and also like a certain level of intrigue as far as how folks are going to engage each other. All right. Any comments or questions, Heather?
Yeah, Margaret has commented that she likes Jim Daly from Focus on the Family. And Wendy is asking, have you ever had a live online event and then posted it as a podcast so that people can choose to attend the live event or listen to it later as a podcast?
So that particular thing, I think it's a question of what podcast feed would you like to distribute it on? There was one time where I had a co-host who did give remarks at a particular event, and we decided to replay them. We did not host the event. He gave remarks at the event, and we decided to replay them on the show. Yeah, I think it depends on what the promise of the particular podcast feed that you are listening to is, right? Like a podcast feed, I would challenge people to be judicious with what they drop in there that's not the show, right? I think it's pretty common to see podcast feeds put trailers for other shows. They may even drop new episodes of another show in there. But I'm assuming if, like anything, if you start to abuse what the primary purpose of, that is, like we can all relate to, for instance, when some company sells your email address or your home address to an advertiser and feeling like, well, it's not really related, and getting progressively more annoyed. So as far as live events are concerned, if they are relevant or they have maybe some bleed over of the host to that live event, then that might be something that would really work and that your audience would actually really like to be informed about and listen to. But I wouldn't encourage people to just blanket drop things in there unless it's a podcast feed specifically for you to put all the webinars in there and to kind of maybe archive it that way.
Yeah, Morgan, I was just thinking, seems like podcast is more of a series. And if you're just doing a one-off of a live event that's been recorded, it's really more of just like a recording of that event than really a podcast.
Right. Well, in podcasts, as you're aware of, it can mean a lot of things, right? I think, Heather, you and I talked about this some when we connected over the summer, but podcasts, for instance, when it comes to a pastor, can often mean just uploading the sermon from Sunday, which, I would argue is a way to use the podcast medium, but is not necessarily a podcast in the sense of it's taking something that was designed for one format and then taking advantage of the ways that you were able to distribute that format again, which is, to me, quite distinct from thinking of how to create something to be consumed first as an audio product, which is not usually how most sermons are.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Debbie has also made some comments about hosts that she likes. She says she likes Julie Royce from Roy's Report, Nathan Foster from Renovere, and Emily Freeman.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sharing your favorite hosts in there. All right, let's talk about the next part, which is segments. Okay. All right. So as you can see, I have another question that I am keeping in right here, which is essentially, how do you get someone's attention to start out with, and how do you keep it and not abuse it in some way? So I'll just tell you a little bit about how we thought about that when it came to Quick to Listen. So I did mention that Quick to Listen in its later years turned into a situation that often ran over an hour, which is a very long time in some ways to have a podcast. I'm aware of interview podcasts that do go 2 or 3 hours, but by and large, podcasts are not that long. So we really had to make sure that we were breaking up our time into ways that people felt was helping them get the most out of every single part, right? So let me just go through a couple different segments that we had. We had a moment where I would essentially give a 1 to 2 minute summary of the news and what that was all about. In fact, I'm going to play for you a little bit of what that sounded like. I hope this is going to start at the correct place. Heather, if you don't mind turning on your camera and just giving me a thumbs up if it's loud enough, that would be great.
100,000 Americans died from April 2020 to April 2021 due to opioids, according to numbers released this week from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The majority of the deaths have come via fentanyl, which accounted for more than 75% of all fatalities. Most of the time, in these instances, fentanyl was used in combination with drugs like methamphetamine or cocaine. Who were those who lost their lives? This is according to the New York Times. The vast majority of these deaths, about 70%, were among men between the ages of 25 and 54. And while the opioid crisis has been characterized as one is primarily impacting white Americans, a growing number of Black Americans have been affected as well. There were regional variations in the death counts, with the largest year-over-year increases exceeding 50% in California, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Vermont's toll was small, but increased by 85% during the reporting period. This week on Quick to Listen, we wanted to talk about the opioid crisis. What is our response as Christians who are in relationship with those affected? And what is our responsibility when we are far away, or at least think we are far away? You're listening to Quick to Listen, where we go beyond hashtags and hot takes to discuss a major cultural event. I'm Morgan Lee, Global Media Manager at Christianity Today.
I'm Ted Olson. I'm Executive Editor of Christianity Today.
All right, Ted, we have some very, very grim numbers here, and I would love to get a gut check from you on your reaction to seeing these really startling stats.
All right. So wanted to play that for you guys because that is an example of our opening segment for the show, which then transitions into our following segment. So as you can see during that segment, I would give a synopsis of what we were talking about that week. That is the beginning of the show. We then moved into introductions, which, as you can tell, relatively brief, didn't have a lot there. And then we did something called a gut check. So the information, as you heard, was presented relatively impersonally. And I kind of gave it in a tone that didn't necessarily give a lot of emotion, which then transitioned into a segment that was basically supposed to be where we gave the most amount of emotion. We called that the gut check. And that was the moment when my co-host and I would tell us, basically tell people how we really felt about whatever was happening. And what made it allowed us a sense to kind of put our opinions in the room. We went on to continue to listen to that podcast. I think that segment may take around 5 minutes. The overall show is not actually about mine and my co-host opinions. It is about the expert that we wanted to bring in. But at the same time, there's a way for what we hope for the listener to feel recognized and like they are in the room themselves because they know where we as the host stand. Then obviously the show would transition to talking to our guest. Usually that was the entire meat and potatoes of the show. Those interviews would normally go about 40 minutes, 50 minutes or so after edits, because we did have someone who would go in there and clean things up. And then we did something, I would say on a recurring, but not every single week basis, where we called it slow to speak, and we encouraged listener feedback. We would read listener emails that had come in and respond to them and discuss them. And we would conclude the show by doing something completely different and tonally to the rest of the show called Precious Moments. And as you can tell, the scope of the things that we talked about on Quick to Listen could be pretty serious, and Precious Moments was not that. It was a moment where people were able to essentially share. We asked people to share like the moment that brought them joy in the past week. And those could be much sillier, much more lighthearted, something that offered people the chance to connect with us all as people, which could be really important after having an intense discussion. So those were things that we repeated week after week. I think that's the important thing to know about segments, is that segments are things that listeners can expect to either show up every week or to show up on a consistent basis. And oftentimes ones that kind of showcase the emotional range of the show. And so you really want to be thoughtful in what it's going to look like. It can be also helpful to think about like, what is the time that you want to allocate to each level of the segment? Obviously, in many ways, like the time that segment is indicates the level of priority that you want to give it. And it's something to be mindful about. Heather, I don't think we have any questions about segments, right? I don't know if anyone has one. They're welcome to throw something in there, but
Nothing so far.
okay. All right, let us continue through this. All right, so we've been talking a lot about conceptually how to build a podcast. I want to give some technical information when it comes to this, because this part is often, what gets asked or what gets Googled. I would say if you have more questions about this, I could try to answer them, but Google also has a number of resources. If you search this, there are, lots of people who have devoted to writing blogs about what they consider to be the best tools out there for podcasts. So I'm going to give you my own take on these, but yeah, there's plenty of other really smart people out there who have thought about this at length. So the first thing I want to talk about is audio tools. So the audio tool that I have used the most is one called Zencastr. And Zencastr is a tool that I pay $20 a month for, and it's fantastic. So when we used to record Quick to Listen, we used Skype, and Skype was not made for podcasts and had the supreme misfortune of the fact that if the person that we were interviewing had audio that cut out, that audio would just be bad. So if they had a poor connection, or if they somehow at some point dropped off, obviously they could be reconnected, but we were in a particular situation where we were kind of stuck with that. The current types of platforms that people are more inclined to use these days are ones where all audio is recorded locally, which basically means that all the audio is recorded from that, from that person's perspective rather than it being piped in. And so Zencastr is one of those platforms where that is true. So at the end of a recording session, I have 3 different audio files from people, and I have to stay on the line after people are done recording and have that audio for their audio to first upload, and then I can download it. The one of these platforms I didn't mention that is very similar in this approach is Riverside. I used that yesterday for the first time. It has the same types of features as Zencastr. And I know that sometimes you can feel unwilling to pay for some of these types of tools, but I personally believe that the recording tools, if you are going to be doing a place where you have remote hosts or you have a remote guest, it's 100% worth investing in some place where you can feel very confident that the level of audio that you're going to get is going to be solid, because that's something that your show is completely reliant on. And for obvious reasons, one of the first things that people judge when they are appraising the podcast in general, or even deciding if they can listen to it. The other thing I would say about this is that both Riverside and Zencastr have significantly changed how they used video. So when I started using Zencastr, I believe it had either just started getting video or was on its way to getting video. And so now you have 3 options when you record. The first one can be just audio, which is generally what I recorded on. I feel very comfortable just speaking to people through an audio only platform. I feel like sometimes people end up reading nonverbals in these places in what I perceive to be an unhelpful way. Or I will also say this, my co-host and I want to talk to each other discreetly during the show. And so that is obviously not possible. It's really hard to have side conversations if everyone has their video on at the same time and you're recording live. Second of all, the thing that video has that to me can sometimes be a little bit challenging is it's another thing to like edit. It can be a lot easier to go back and edit audio retroactively, cut stuff. We would cut sometimes places where guests would ramble for a really long time, or if guests did not have a complete clarity about what we were asking them, we might have to repeat something. And so it really helped, in my opinion, to go the audio only route. But there's a lot of, people who feel most comfortable these days on video. We've spent a lot of time looking at our Zoom screens. We're used to communicating with people with video over, tools like FaceTime. And so that can be something. So both Zencastr and Riverside allow you to also record video at the same time, which is significant because many times podcasts are uploaded to YouTube these days. And so if you are obviously trying to do that, you're going to need to have video. And so both of those platforms allow it. Again, they both are subscription tools that cost money, but in my opinion, it's 100% money well spent. Heather, do we have a question?
We don't. I have a question for you. What about using Zoom for your podcast? What would be the positives and negatives of that?
So again, from what I understand about this, when I've recorded on Zoom before, which happened one time when one of our recording tools was down, it records everything as one single audio file, right? So ideally, maybe you're the producer, someone else is the producer / editor, mixer, whatever. They're going to be handling the audio. Most of them would prefer to have separate audio tracks, right? Especially if you've inconsistent volume, or if someone has a dog that is barking in the background, or there's some sort of interference happening. It's far easier to cut that, to mute that person, to change it when you have 3 separate audio tracks. If you only have one audio track that everyone's on, everyone will live and die by another person's audio. Now, I realize that there are things like people being muted and so forth, but I actually don't want people to just mute themselves necessarily, right? I mean, it depends on the type of show. I'm obviously speaking from a place in which we had 3 people in a room talking to each other a lot of the time, right? And so to have people always go on mute can, in my opinion, hurt some of the candid levelness that you want, but that's not for every show, right? And so maybe if you have a more formal approach to your show, Zoom can end up working. But because Zencastr and Riverside allow you to have that separate audio situation and they have it recorded locally, definitely recommend those.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Morgan.
There are lots of things that must be done, alas, after you have recorded something. And I think that one of the things that made me able to do a show for as long as I did, for 5.5 years, was that I did not necessarily do a ton of them. We had someone who I would upload our files to the day that we recorded, and overnight he would edit them and then he would upload it so that when I came into the office the next morning, the audio file was already there. I wrote a little bit of text and I published the show, right? So I did not spend a ton of time in the auto editing realm, but these are the programs that I'm aware that people use. I will just highlight a couple of them. One of them is Descript. So I have several friends that really, really swear by Descript. Descript, the way that it works is that you upload your audio onto the tool and it produces a transcript of your conversation. It can identify when there's different speakers happening, and then you are more easily able to edit the audio by editing a transcript instead. So essentially, let's say that someone went on a monologue that's not appropriate for the show. You are able to delete those words of them saying that, which ends up deleting the actual monologue that they said. And for a lot of people who are used to editing and working in text first, it can be far easier than, trying to pull up the sound files and figure out the exact moment when something's supposed to be edited, or maybe even trying to guess exactly where you should be doing that. So Descript is a tool that can be a lot easier for us, for those who are from backgrounds where we work in text a lot. It does also cost money. It's another subscription thing. So I'm aware that people do this, although many of these, except Audacity, I want to say, or GarageBand often comes on people's computers. Audacity, I believe, is open source and you can download it. But a lot of these do cost money. Pro Tools, it's probably the most expensive. Adobe Audition, I know like places like NPR use it. Hindenburg is what our producer for Quick to Listen used. But some other folks on our podcast team use Descript, which is how I became familiar with it. All right. Any questions for us, Heather?
Just a comment about Brad has posted that he uses iZotope RX10 for cleaning and optimizing audio, and wondered if you had any experience with that. He says, I believe that the standard version now supports editing via text.
I'm not really surprised that many of these are like adopting great features that other places have, right? This industry has, I mentioned earlier that there's been a lot of momentum about people wanting to start a podcast. It took a little bit of time, I think, for the tools that were available to catch up with people's desire to want to start a podcast, but it really seems like those are relatively equal now. So I don't know about iZotope. I'm glad that it seems like there's other great tools out there. Definitely cleaning your audio is important. I'm glad that there's so many things out there that make it easier for people to do that. Yeah. All right. Let's go to the next one. All right. So you have produced your podcast episode, and now you are in a place where you are going to try to make it available for other people to find. You are going to need some place to host the show. For a long time, we used SoundCloud. SoundCloud is, I believe it is free. If it's not free, I don't remember how much we were paying for it. I apologize. It was fine, but SoundCloud was very rudimentary for us when it came to ads. And the thing about that was that I believe for a long time we were hard coding, or so to speak, the ads into the podcasts, right? So in other words, our podcast producer had to put the podcast ads in the show themselves. And that is maybe okay if you are in this place where your podcast is fortunate to have ads, but isn't getting a ton of traffic, right? But you are working for a bigger show oftentimes when you work with advertisers, you make particular deals around the fact that, okay, if my podcast gets 250,000, this ad will play on my podcast for the first 250,000 listens. And after that, it won't. What are you going to do? Are you going to go back into that podcast? Or are you going to create another version of it where you take that ad out, right? Or what happens if the ads become really dated, or in some instances say things that we now realize are offensive, or there's some sort of weird situation where the ad really should not be playing for whatever reason. And so eventually we transitioned to Megaphone. I know I'm talking about a lot of paid stuff here. Megaphone is another one of these paid tools that's out there. And part of the reason that we did that is they make it extremely easy to insert ads. In fact, I and my producer rarely did stuff with ads. We had situations where essentially our advertising team was the team that would upload the ads separately. Our producer would pick the moments where the ads would go on the actual podcast themselves. You put in the particular times that you would like to do that, and the ads get dynamically inserted. That's what you would call them. So that does mean that sometimes ads would get pulled, not in any type of negative way, but because we hit the listener thresholds that we would do that, we would take the ads out. And I don't know if you guys have experienced it, but sometimes I have gone on to listen to what I understand to be like a pretty popular podcast, and it has no ads. And oftentimes that has happened. What has happened is that podcast has reached that number of listens that it had agreed to with the advertiser. So they have yanked those ads there. And then the version I'm listening to is ad free. So that is one of the things that I find best about Megaphone. Megaphone and SoundCloud have different metrics that they use to help you capture what a listen is. SoundCloud was a lot more generous with what they counted as a listen. So our overall listens did fall when we moved to Megaphone. But just different things to keep in mind because they are the ones that will track that type of stuff. All right. So music is something that I think everyone is aware of, is a huge part of a podcast. I don't know how many people listen to podcasts on Spotify, but from what I understand was one of the advantages of people who have agreements with Spotify where they essentially are only Spotify podcasts is that Spotify allows anyone to use any type of song that's in their music catalog. And that is not true for most of us in these particular situations. So the stuff that I put here, YouTube, obviously you cannot just pick any type of things, but there are, there's basically music that you're able to buy, royalty-free music that is on YouTube that you can search for. I just thought I would play one of my podcast intros because I love the music for that show. And I think it just reinforces how important it is to choose good music.
A podcast to encourage and sharpen the church through telling stories of Christians whose faith were shaped by sickness and by praying with fellow believers around the world. I'm Morgan Lee. Kateri Takakweta became the first Native American saint in 2012. Much of her life.
All right. Well, I apologize for starting that in the middle of my thing. That was from my podcast, Prayer Amid Pandemic. I always really loved the music for that show. That is music that we bought on some royalty-free website. And I thought it was kind of refreshing to have a church history podcast, more or less, be scored by something that felt a little bit more hip hop. I think it gave people just a broader sense of what the podcast was trying to do. Obviously, there's so many different moods that you can bring in that will affect how people see it. I tried to look for new music for Quick to Listen sometime in the middle of 2021. We had a lot of issues with that. I noticed in my own self that learning how to describe music for composers or producers is challenging. We were working with someone who was trying to create custom music for that. But this is going to be something that, I think is worth investing several hours listening to different tracks, thinking about who you're trying to reach with that music or who you're not trying to reach with that music. If you want the music to establish a level of seriousness or exclusivity or playfulness, those are all things that music really helps to, either help you sell along with the words that you're saying, or it can undermine it in some way. Heather, do we have a question come through?
Just a comment from Margaret. She says she likes artist It's not royalty free, but they are generous with their licensure.
Okay, everyone, thank you for sharing additional resources. Those are, I didn't know about that, Margaret, and I'm glad that you're sharing them. All right, so I mentioned earlier that I did a personal project podcast during the pandemic. As you can no doubt tell, this feels very 2020 version of how we experienced the pandemic. And I would encourage anyone who is in this stage of, wanting to start a podcast and so forth, that you take time and you go on to whatever tool that you use to listen to your podcast, and you search some different things. So Quick to Listen was a podcast that already existed when we started, and yet it was not a podcast that we felt had enough clout or prestige as to dissuade us from using it. But another podcast called Quick to Listen did exist, and that was something that we had to make a intentional decision about. I'm positive that there are more podcasts called All Alone right now. I remember looking at different terms that we wanted to use, that evoked isolation, lockdown, and so forth. And we went with this one, as you can tell with the window situation. There's a sense of solitude. I think it was really important for me when we were doing name and graphic stuff that the thumbnail be something that when someone was staring at it on their phone, they could read it and they could easily identify it with it. I feel like I have pretty strong opinions about graphics a lot of times. I often feel like people try to cram a lot of words onto it, and I don't agree. I think your podcast should be no longer than 5 words if you can help it, because those thumbnails on your phone are not that big. And obviously there's a lot of media companies, for instance, that do podcasts. Those media companies have other ways to distribute their shows. And so, headlines oftentimes at different, newspapers or online publications, they will go a lot longer than 5 words, right? And so maybe people are finding about the podcast via that way. But if you're literally trying to find it on some sort of podcast search engine, to me, it's not super advisable that you're picking something that's super wordy. And in general, I just don't think you should pick something that's super wordy. If you think of almost any newspaper, for instance, a lot of newspapers have very short names. Again, because you give people sometimes a mouthful and it's hard. But you're also going to make sure, as I mentioned before, that this is something that you are not fighting for a lot of people when it comes to visibility of your show. Obviously, you would want people to be able to type in the show name and have your podcast and only your podcast show up. And that is something that is definitely worth taking into consideration before, creating all the memorabilia that you're going to do that around that. All right, we are moving into the end of this presentation, and it's important that we talk at this point about how people are going to find your show. So it's great. You've spent all this time and hard work thinking about your show, figuring out why people are going to listen to it week after week, figuring out how you're going to make it compelling and interesting, how you are going to personally have enough content to play this out over this period of time. All great things that you've taken into consideration. How are people going to find the show? So I had just mentioned right now that a lot of podcasts do come out through news outlets, right? And I'm sure we've also been in situations where podcasts often come out through word of mouth. Very rarely we see podcasts make their way into mainstream coverage of something. So probably the biggest one that people are familiar with is Serial. I think there's been other true crime podcasts that have kind of caught the attention of news coverage, and they want to show it as well. But in general, those are not how people are going to be able to find your podcasts, right? The first thing I wanted to highlight is podcast networks. So Christianity Today has a podcast network of podcasts that Christianity themselves is not producing. However, these are podcasts that, are done by fellow Christians who often, and of course, naturally, feel some sort of affinity to CT enough that they would like to be a part of this podcast network. And the podcast network offers a couple of different advantages. One of those advantages being that we end up selling ads for the network. And so shows that might not be able to negotiate ads on their own are able to still get ads onto their show and to gain ad revenue because they are part of a larger network. But what I would like to point out about that is that it additionally helps too, because oftentimes some of those ads are going to be ads for other podcasts in the network. And so your show can be playing, maybe a trailer for your show might be able to drop in the feed of another show, or you might be able to play an ad for your show on another podcast in the network. Trailers are important, I would say. They're often the thing that, you may be able to get someone to more easily commit to listening to 1 to 2 minutes of audio on something. It's what usually is easily to be shared on social media. It's a thing that you're also able to, oh yes, this is important. So when you're starting your podcast feed, you're often going to want to do something that is able to plant a flag there. And you don't necessarily want that to be your first episode. You want to give people time to discover the feed, to find the feed, to follow the feed. And having a trailer is one of the ways that you do that. Spotify also basically tags the trailer on Spotify, right? So if I search my podcast on Spotify, what I end up finding is that the first thing that shows up on there is the trailer. And in fact, I really made it a priority for Quick to Listen that we produce something that was a high quality trailer, because that was often how people were going to experience it first. And so a trailer is definitely worth putting together. Again, it depends on kind of how much energy and time that you want to put into that, because it can be a little bit time consuming. But it does play a really important purpose. I mentioned ads before, as they exist through podcast network, but obviously there may be times where you want to pay money to advertise on a show that is not, already in your podcast network. You specifically want to find that. Again, ads are really great when it comes to podcasts, because you can take advantage of another podcast that has, at this point built up a decent number of listeners that you may not have at the moment. And then there's obviously just traditional advertising. Probably the biggest way that I see is that podcast hosts go on the shows of other podcasts. And so I definitely see people making the rounds a decent amount. Podcasters like to have other podcasters on their shows. They like to bring people in. I mean, this is kind of just essentially what we see a lot happening in TV and the entertainment world as well, but I definitely see it happen to podcasts all the time. All right, I will officially open the floor for questions if people have some. I know that people have asked questions throughout, and Heather, I don't know if I answered all the questions that were asked at the beginning, but I'm pretty much done with sharing some of this information right now.
Let me go back to those questions. All right, so one of them is, have you discovered that if there is a sweet spot in terms of length for a podcast? And then the other was, have you found that podcasts that involve more than one presenter, whether it's an interview or a team going back and forth, tend to be better received?
Okay. As far as, I'll take the interview one first and then I'll do the length one. I would just say it's important for the interviewers to have a good dynamic with each other. So there's different ways that it can happen when a guest comes in. I was listening to a podcast a couple weeks ago where the guest essentially he had showed up enough times on the show that he almost kind of was like a guest host along with them, right? There was more banter and informal conversation. However, if that is not the rapport that you have with a guest, and you're doing a 2-on-1 interview, I did 2-on-1 interviews for a very long time. I think they're awesome, partially because it's great to have more voices represented. I think at the same time, though, it's super important that you and your co-host are communicating. So in this instance, on Quick to Listen, we had a Google Doc that was open the entire time, and we were communicating who's taking what question, did it go next. There was a lot of stuff that was happening while we were recording to better coordinate. And even then, there were times where we didn't coordinate and still talked on top of each other, or so on or so forth. So that type of stuff happens. I do like dual, well done co-hosted shows. As far as the other question, as far as length, I think it really depends on how often, how much there is to say, obviously, and how often you want to come out. I've noticed for a lot of these shows that are daily, they decided that their sweet spot is usually in the 25-minute mark. I don't think anyone here is putting out a show that will come out on a daily basis. But I do think if you're going to go over the half an hour mark, you have to think intentionally why. I think in general, answering that why question of why am I trying to make this? What am I trying to accomplish is so important in general. But I would strongly, strongly encourage people to then think like, okay, so how will I do that through the segments? How are the segments that I'm trying to do helping me towards that actual goal of answering that why question? And do I really need them to be as long as possible? I mean, at the risk of hurting a couple egos, right? In general, we're not necessarily as clever or as funny as our friends might find us or so forth. And we may really enjoy rambling and going off subject when we are in a situation where we are just having a dinner party or so forth, or hanging out with our friends. But when you're doing a podcast, I would not assume that everyone loves all the banter as much as you do. They may love some of it, but they may also be there for something that they feel is more in depth. There are obvious, exceptions to that. Some podcasts that are only banter, right? And only people teasing each other. But that is not necessarily what you're going to do. So I would say after the half an hour mark, really, really think why it needs to go on for half an hour after that. And it definitely, there could be really great reasons, but you might have a tougher sell to get someone initially interested in an hour-long podcast.
Thank you, Morgan. We have another question from the Accessible Hope group. And the question is, how can you talk about monotonizing podcasts?
Sorry, monetizing or?
Yeah. Sorry, monetizing.
So I think a lot of that, there's a couple of ways that monetizing happens. One of that is the ad situation. And for podcasts that are not, like, occasionally I do see indie podcasts build up an audience into such a way that they're able to sell ads, or that advertisers seek them out and want to sell things for them. However, it's going to be challenging if you're not part of a publishing house or part of these podcast networks to accomplish that. Like, that's just how it goes. And so will your podcast be able to make that type of money? Not necessarily. Having said all that, you may have noticed that not only does quote unquote everyone want to start a podcast, but another situation that has happened is that a lot more, I would say, influencers want to be on podcast platforms. And so a podcast can sometimes become an extension of the larger brand that they are trying to do, and potentially help them with their almost existing business of being an influencer, right? That's not exactly super helpful, but I've seen also people start podcasts because they have written a book. And so it becomes an extension of a book promotion that they're trying to do. Podcasts, I'm sure many people could say that it has led to speaking opportunities. My personal podcast, I would say, as far as things that has offered me, I hosted the podcast for 5.5 years. It has not led to much. I don't think I was offered very many speaking opportunities through that. Or book deals or so forth. I only say that to say that, like, there's not some sort of guarantee, right? That if you host a podcast for a certain amount of time, even if you gain a certain amount of listeners, that it's automatically going to give you, the platform that you may be hoping. Obviously it could, but there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question about how to monetize a show, other than the fact that it is not really that simple. And if you're trying to go into it for the financial situation, I don't think it's a good use of your time, in the sense of podcasting can be quite labor intensive, and the amount of work that you're going to put in for it, for the amount of money that you're going to make, if you're doing it again as some sort of indie fun project, may not be there.
Another question from Debbie, which I think you touched on a little bit, but I'll ask it here. It's, has the world of podcasts been saturated? Do we have too many of them?
So I generally don't think that we have too many of them, in the sense, well, here's a couple things that I will say about that. So many people have gone back to the office since 2020, but many people have not. And many people who have not are also, white collar people, many of whom are the demographic who listens to podcasts, right? And so not everyone in the US listens to podcasts. A lot of people who do listen to podcasts also consume them not as podcasts, but as videos. But of the people that do listen to podcasts, a lot of people were listening to them on their commutes, right? When commuting time is something that you may or may not have anymore. Something I don't have anymore. And so my podcast consumption has definitely gone down during that time. So the amount of podcast intake that people may feel that they can have is maybe less than it used to be. I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to say that people can often feel like, oh, I'm getting behind on a podcast. You'll hear people use that type of language. They might say there's too many podcasts. I don't really ascribe to any of those things so much to say that shouldn't really keep you from making a podcast, assuming that you have some sort of thing that you think that other people are not saying that you think is important to say. So that's really, to me, the most important thing that's out there is that you have really thought carefully about how your podcast offers something that other podcasts, currently aren't doing. Oh, I also would say, like, in the Christian market, I think there's a lot of space for really interesting, thoughtful, creative ideas because I will say this, feels very oversaturated with sermon podcasts. There definitely are a number of interview podcasts in the Christian world, but there's also, when you look up podcasts oftentimes by religion and spirituality and you look at the rankings, it can feel very flooded with sermons, which again, I do not technically see as podcasts.
Margaret is asking what the microphone and stand is that you're using in the picture.
Great question. So we actually used these types of mics. My ability to geek out on microphones is limited, but we use this because we had a studio at Christianity Today's office for a long time. And I'm pretty sure these mics are like relatively similar to what you might see being used at, any given event that needs sound. I have since, when I left Chicago, I ended up getting a Shure microphone, SHURE, which I think is like one of the top line microphones out there. When I recorded the podcast yesterday, I used that microphone. This microphone was actually taken from what I was using in the studio. This photo shoot was done for something else, but yeah.
Accessible Hope is asking, what are your thoughts on podcast seasons versus just having continuous content?
Thank you for asking. I should have mentioned that earlier. I love seasons. I think seasons are a fantastic way for people to essentially not feel like they need to put out content at length, and for you, again, to be a little bit more thoughtful and strategic with what you are offering your listeners, right? Oftentimes seasons have some sort of theme or some sort of time frame that they exist in. And I think they're a wonderful way to organize your time and what you do. And also because, again, going back to the idea of podcast being something that's very time consuming, I think that they can help you feel like you can then take a break. Quick to Listen did not have seasons. And I mentioned that because I was in this constant tug of war with my co-hosts where they would want to just be like, we can take a week off. But we didn't really, in my opinion, have any precedent for taking a week off. And obviously the news did not stop. And we could sometimes record episodes ahead of time. And so I was like, no, I think we should put on a show. People are still going to be hungry and wanting to hear this particular information. But I do think that most of the time, especially if you're doing this as a side project, you will want to do seasons rather than, record indefinitely.
Yeah, that's great. I think we have one other question here from Margaret. She says that they have a trailer. It's on Spotify, but it's at the bottom and the last thing they see instead of the first. How would I set it up to actually be a trailer, like in the way you mentioned a trailer being used?
Does it say trailer? The only reason I ask is because I actually felt like Spotify somehow intuited that was supposed to be the trailer.
Yeah, she says mine says trailer.
Okay. I should figure that out. Thank you for pinpointing something that I am not as sure about. This is where some of the delegating that I did to our producer shows, because I am not able to answer your question in particular. But I'll search around and see if I can find the answer to that, because I'm genuinely curious too how Spotify recognized that. Yeah, it's a good question.
Does anyone else have any questions? I don't see anything else here. I think we're at a good point where we can wrap up. So Morgan, if you could stop sharing screen, we'll have Mary Kay put up our closing slides. Until the next time, I encourage you to consider joining the communications group, which you can find after clicking on groups on the top menu on the Missio Nexus website. This will enable you to connect with other people engaged in marketing and communications. Thank you, Morgan, and to everyone else who joined and participated with us. I'm Heather Pubels, along with Mary Kay and Hannah, our production team.